focused discussion tonight. Saturday marked the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. It was a day of reflection, remembrance, and service. Last Friday, our In Focus topic featured the stories of people affected by 9/11. Tonight, we want to go into what changed that day for our country, where we are now on an international scale, and what we've learned over the last 2 decades. Joining us tonight are Professor Amos Guiora from the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. And via Zoom, Janicke Stramer-Smith, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Weber State University. Thank you both for being with us tonight. We will start with Professor Guiora. Professor, can you tell us your 9/11 story? Where were you and what do you remember the most about that day?
Sure, that Tuesday afternoon, for us it was a Tuesday afternoon because I was living in Israel. I was serving in the Israel Defense Forces. It was about mid-afternoon, 4 o'clock-ish, when we started getting phone calls that something had happened in New York. It was unclear exactly what. And then the rest of the day unfolded. And then it became clear to us, again, in the context of the Israel Defense Forces, that this was clearly a terrorist attack on a level that had not occurred. It raised questions in terms of what potentially would happen in Israel. How would that impact Israel, America, the Middle East? But obviously the immediate concern, once we saw the pictures, we realized that this was something, to call it extraordinary would be an understatement. Those of us who had family in the United States immediately tried to find them. But the immediate reaction, again, from the Israeli perspective and the IDF, was to think about the possible operational ramifications from the perspective of the Israel Defense Forces.
Professor Stramer-Smith, what about you? What's your 9/11 story?
Well, I was living in Monterey, California at the time, right next to the Defense Language Institute. So we were a little bit concerned because we didn't know if this was going to be just New York or and the Pentagon, or whether there would be a West Coast operation as well. So I woke up that morning, turned on the TV, and I woke up. So I was on the West Coast, so I was a bit behind. So it was just the airplane hitting the tower over and over again. It was very scary. And then I had actually just started taking Arabic classes with quite a few military wives in it who were all expecting that their husbands were going to be deployed to the Gulf and they were all going to go as families. And now that completely changed. So I just remember the fear and anxiety, not knowing what was going to happen next.
Professor Stramer-Smith, stay with us. I'll direct this next question to you first. Could you talk about the change in our nation's collective mindset from when the first plane hit to the second plane striking?
Sure. Well, I think it was sort of a disbelief that this could happen on American soil. And I think also the second plane kind of created that fear that we didn't know if there was anything else that was going to happen. And I feel that lasted actually beyond the second plane and for several days after.
And Professor Guiora, what would you like to add, or what are your thoughts?
Once the gravity of the attack became clear in New York, and then the Pentagon, and then evidently the foiled attack in Pennsylvania, it became very clear, as I said earlier, that this was on a totally different scale. Obviously, the questions that immediately began to be asked was above and beyond, how did this happen? Who was responsible? How did they get to the United States? How would this impact whatever term global security meant at the time? And it's important to remember, looking back in hindsight, the terms that are today so common, I'm not sure really part of the lexicon at the time. And I think from an Israeli perspective, there was a sense that this was going to bring the United States into the world of terrorism in a way the United States, absent Oklahoma City, had not really been confronted with terrorism. And again, wearing an Israeli hat here, that there was a sense that perhaps now America would better understand the complexities and difficulties and dilemmas of dealing with terrorism, counterterrorism, the way that we in Israel have been dealing with since, the past decades.
Professor Guiora, in the days and weeks after that event, there was national, even global unity. But when do you think that attitude started to change?
So I have to be careful in my answer because I wasn't living here at the time. But I do recall the following. And shortly after 9/11, we created a committee of inquiry in Israel to see what kind of lessons learned we might offer to the United States. And one of the suggestions we had, and I was sent in March of 2002 to the U.S., was the suggestion that establishing Guantanamo would be a really bad idea. And I met with who were involved in establishing Guantanamo. And based on our experience with establishing alternative judicial paradigms, I warmly recommended to whomever that Guantanamo would not be a good idea. Well, obviously, Rosie, I'm not much of a salesman because Guantanamo was established. And I remember that evening having a conversation with those individuals. And I told them that they had forgotten the first rule of counterterrorism, which is that terrorists have rights. And I think in that critical, immediate aftermath of 9/11, that critical principle, it's a cardinal principle of terrorism, that terrorists have rights. The United States forgot it, and the consequences that we can get into that, the consequences of forgetting that principle were, from my perspective, dramatic.
And Professor Stramer-Smith, we have about 30 seconds left before we have to go to break. Is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think there was a couple of things that happened. If I focus for a moment on the international aspect, especially the allies, you could say that the attitude started to change once we started talking about Iraq also. Already people were not loving the idea of giving money and weapons to warlords and militias. Done that before, it didn't work out so well. But the Iraq war and trying to include that into the war on terror really split the European coalition. And this was something that actually started quite early on. And so I feel that the international support started to wane from that moment on.
All right, my friends, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our in-focus discussion on the long tail of 9/11. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the long tail of 9/11. We continue our conversation now with Professor Amos Guiora from the University of Utah, and via Zoom, Professor Janicke Stramer-Smith from Weber State University. Professor Guiora, we'll start with you in this segment. What can you tell us about the authority to use military force granted to President Bush in the months after the event and how it led to the Afghan war?
One of the great mistakes in the aftermath of 9/11 was Congress literally turning its powers over to the president and granting literally unlimited use of force, authorization for force. I think in retrospect, I think those who voted in favor of it would probably raise their hand. And if they were honest, they would admit, A, they didn't carefully read the language, B, that they realized they made a mistake, C, there were no measures for accountability, and D, the consequences are exactly as as it has unfolded in Afghanistan. I think in the annals of American history, Congress made two critical mistakes. One was the authorization to use force, and two was the legislating of the Patriot Act. In both instances, I think members of Congress, quote unquote, fell prey to media attention, to public clamoring to do something. And the consequences of giving that kind of power to the Bush administration without any sense of checks and balances. The Supreme Court also, from my perspective, absolutely failed to engage the executive branch in the context of checks and balances. Again, Rosie, we could sit here for hours talking about what came as a result of that. I think Congress failed, the Supreme Court failed, the executive branch failed. The consequences were terrible.
Professor Stramer-Smith, could you talk a bit about the objective of the war in Afghanistan and how it changed over time?
Sure. Well, initially, it was quite a simple mission. It was to find bin Laden and kill him, and this was tasked to the CIA. Who have special forces that do this kind of thing. Now, they weren't successful in doing that, though. And actually, because they didn't send the right forces, neither the special forces nor the Navy SEALs in greater numbers to the actual area of Afghanistan where bin Laden was hiding out, he was able to slip away into Pakistan. And next thing we know, the focus and the objective of the war sort of changed from being just about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and actually about the Taliban and regime change and then eventually democratization. And this was not actually something that the military was going to be able to succeed in doing. State crafting is not a military operation, right? Military can be tasked with taking out the enemy, with conducting warfare, but you have to do a completely different kind of strategy for regime change or democratization. And so what also happened was the war in Iraq shifted focus. It split the resources, it split the military personnel, it also split the focus of the administration in selling war to the public, the American public and the international public. And that really hurt the mission. And like Amos said, really the consequences were terrible from this. And then it became, let's get out of Afghanistan. And that took a very long time to do. And then once it was finally done, here in the last month, it was not executed well.
Professor Guiora, the case was made for a war in Iraq on evidence that actually turned out to be false. How did that change our country internally, and did it make us more divisive and diminish trust in government?
So when then Director of the CIA, George Tenet, said to President Bush about the WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction, that it's a slam dunk, Tenet lied. When Colin Powell went to the Security Council to convince the international community that Iraq had the WMDs, Colin Powell lied. In terms of the question of credibility amongst the public, both the United States and internationally, there's no doubt that the Bush administration to declare that there are WMDs in Iraq predicated on shaky intelligence is the polite version, I think no doubt impacted how the American public viewed it and absolutely how the international community viewed it. While Powell and Tenet are disgraced, I think it cast a long shadow as to why America was going into Iraq, raising the questions whether President Bush was, quote unquote, closing the account with Saddam Hussein that his father had not closed when, when the Bush, the father, went into Kuwait and Iraq. The articulation, quote unquote, of going into Iraq is absolutely predicated on misinformation, disinformation, polite words for a lie. And I think the long-term damage to American credibility is significant.
And Professor Guiora, can you also talk about the rise of the security state, Homeland Security, the change in mission for the FBI? What did our nation gain and what did we lose?
So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there were clearly measures put into place, largely focused on air safety because of obviously what caused 9/11. But it also resulted in terrible violations of civil rights, the whole profiling of Muslims, the profiling of quote-unquote individuals who look like Middle Easterns, the long-term detention of 5,000 men, some of them for visa violations, but on the predicate that they look like they were from the Middle East. It's important, I take you back, Rosie, to what I said earlier, that the rule number one in operational counterterrorism is that terrorists have rights. And here the overreaction, which in many ways we still see today, I travel a great deal. There are measures in place that I can't articulate to you why they're in place. One of the difficulties in a security apparatus, it becomes rote-like. You do it because you do it without really stepping back and asking yourself, are you addressing the real threat, or are you still functioning or analyzing predicated on a post-threat, previous threat, rather than a future threat? One of the difficulties in this entire conversation when we look back and look forward, I think this is what you're getting at, is have we actually learned anything? And are we institutionalizing change in reaction and reflection of new threats rather than only focusing on old threats?
Professor Stramer-Smith, can you talk about drone strikes and contractors in the U.S. military? Was this a new phenomenon, and how are these strategies being viewed in the world?
Well, I mean, drones and the idea of sort of outsourcing military fighting outsourcing military operations isn't necessarily new on the world stage, but drones, of course, is a newer technology. Both of them have changed warfare forever, both domestically, how it's handled, because it gives presidents a lot more leeway to engage in warfare without actually having to ask Congress as much permission as normally. And also it sort of leaves out sometimes the allies, and that has created some discontent among European allies that the American presidents, and that goes for all of them since 9/11, have been more and more engaged in warfare unilaterally and not asking the allies ahead of time, sometimes actually catching them a bit off guard, when they actually also have troops there, right? It's not just the United States that has been stationing troops and fighting in Afghanistan. It's been also the NATO allies, the Danes, the Brits, Poles, so on and so forth. So, but now you can kind of cut out some of that alliance building that you need to do and just carry out your mission without worrying too much about who else is involved. However, there is a human cost to the use of drones and contractors that we're not necessarily always prepared to deal with. Not so much on our end, but on the civilians on the ground, right? And that can make it feel a little bit like the U.S. has gone rogue in some instances, where they are deciding whether or not someone is a terrorist or not a terrorist, and then striking them from the air.
Professor, I'm going to have to cut you off right there. We do have to toss the break real quick, but hang tight, both of you. We'll be right back with our In Focus discussion on the long tail of 9/11. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the long tail of 9/11. We resume our discussion now with Professor Amos Guiora of the University of Utah and Professor Janicke Stramer-Smith of Weber State University. Professor Guiora, let's talk about some due process points. No terrorist has been brought to trial for 9/11, but many are being held in places like Guantanamo Bay. What exactly does that mean?
So let's take a step back and ask how people got to Guantanamo and the whole lack of due process and the lack of judicial process. I remind you that in the aftermath of 9/11, there's a memo called the Bybee Memo, which was written by Professor John Yoo, but signed by Bybee, who today is a district court judge in Nevada, U.S. District Court, which created a torture paradigm in the United States. It's an absolute violation of international law, and it's an absolute violation of American law, because the United States is signatory to the Convention Against Torture. That memo, which is a forever stain on America, authorized a torture-based interrogation regime. It's beyond extraordinary and beyond illegal. From there, we move forward to the establishment of Guantanamo, and I take you back what I said earlier about my great success in convincing the Americans not to move forward with Guantanamo, and the fact that people have been held in Guantanamo, what former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld called the worst of the worst. It's a paradigm that has not worked. Have there been terrorists who've been brought to trial in the United States? Yes. Has Guantanamo failed? Absolutely. The initial premise of bringing people without any sense of judicial review, any sense of independent review, violates clearly American law, but that's why it was established in Guantanamo. I think from the perspective of due process, status of prisoner, status of rights, torture, there's no doubt that 9/11 from a legal perspective, civil rights perspective, without a doubt is an extraordinary failure when examined through the lens of due process and the protection of rights. Yes, some of these people were genuinely bad, there's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that you can torture them, and that doesn't mean you can create the kind of paradigm where in essence they are in absolute limbo in a sort of indefinite detention, some of them 20 years later.
Professor Stramer-Smith, now that our troops are out of Afghanistan and we have less of a presence in the Middle East, who is filling that void internationally?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, and it remains to be seen how exactly it'll play out. I mean, it probably would have been the wisest had we left some troops behind, like the Pentagon wanted. But what we're looking at is regionally, Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are the bigger regional powers there, are going to be filling some of the void in the region. Internationally, definitely Russia is going to be filling a void, and perhaps China. The U.S. will definitely appear weakened because of the way that the pullout happened, and honestly, the Taliban taking over control so quickly looks terrible. It doesn't look like the United States achieved anything at all from that perspective, and it doesn't give a lot of credence to what they have been doing there for the last 20 years, especially in terms of state crafting.
Now, professors, we have to wrap soon, but I'll give both of you 30 seconds to answer this final question. We've been talking about a lot of negatives that came out from the decisions over the past 20 years. Professor Guiora, do you see any positives?
It's a positive, negative, negative, positive. That the American public today is aware of terrorism as it really is. I think that in terms of, the traditional rose-colored American view of viewing things, I think there's a much more sober understanding of the realities of the world. And for that again, positive, negative, I think it is important in terms of understanding geopolitics that the American public understand that terrorism is real. We shouldn't exaggerate the threat, but we need to be cognizant of that. Other than that, if I review the past 20 years, largely a negative.
And Professor Stramer-Smith, 30 seconds to you. Any positives in your opinion?
Well, I would echo some of what Amos said, and then I would add to it that, I mean, the one positive perhaps you could see would be that the New World and regional order that came out of this vacuum that was left and the change was basically a mindset change also of disaffected Arab youths. And that can maybe be seen as an impetus for some of the Arab Spring movements. Now, have the Arab Spring movements been successful? Mostly not. But Tunisia is the one then shining example. Yes, they're facing some trouble now, but they can maybe still overcome. So you could say that might have been some sort of impetus for some of these more positive social movements have been pushing back against authoritarianism.
You've been hearing from Professor Amos Guiora from the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah and Professor Janicke Stramer-Smith from Weber State University. Thank you both for your insight tonight. We appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by searching for ABC4 In Focus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.